the firstborn of humanity, and the first to spill blood.
He is the first to labor under the curse that does not belong to him, and yet becomes part of him.
Cain, the first infant to cry outside the gates of Eden.
The firstborn of humanity, and the first to spill blood. Before there were nations, before there were cities, before there were kings or prophets or laws, there was a field. And before there was a field, there was a family, Adam, Eve, and the child who opened human history with his first breath. Cain, the firstborn of the human race. The first infant to cry outside the gates of Eden. The first hope that life could continue after perfection was lost. His birth was not ordinary, it was mythic. Eve looked at her son and said with trembling hope, "I have gotten a man with the help of the Lord." In her voice there was longing, perhaps even a flicker of the ancient promise that one day a child would crush the serpent's head. Maybe she wondered, even silently, if this firstborn might be the beginning of restoration. If this child, born from the dust of exile, might one day lead humanity back toward the God they had walked away from. Cain grew up hearing the stories of Eden not as legend, but as memory. His parents had walked in a garden where God's footsteps were as real as the wind. They had known the sound of his voice the way children know the sound of their mother calling them home. And Cain, the first child of the fallen world, grew up beside the ache of that loss. Every sigh of Adam, every wistful silence of Eve, was a ripple of a paradise he would never touch. This alone creates a strange tenderness around Cain's life. He is not a villain entering the story in darkness. He is a child born into grief that is older than he is. A child raised by two people who love God deeply, but carry the weight of a mistake that reshaped the world. Cain grows up in a landscape where every sunrise is beautiful but broken. Every harvest is a struggle. Every breath is tinged with memory. He is the first to labor under the curse that does not belong to him and yet becomes part of him. He becomes a worker of the soil, following in Adam's path. He learns to coax life out of stubborn ground. He learns the ache of sweat in the Sunday. He learns the satisfaction of fruit that comes from toil. The soil cuts his hands, but it shapes him. It gives him a sense of purpose, a sense of being somebody in a world with no guideposts. When you are the firstborn of creation, there is no map to follow. Cain makes his own. But beneath that hard-working exterior lies a heart that yearns to be seen, to be valued, to be acknowledged by both God and man. He is the first human to feel the complex storm of identity without a model. He is the first to ask the unspoken question, "Does my life matter?" And because he works the ground, because he feels the sting of the earth's resistance every day, he wants the God who created that earth to notice the effort, to see him, to affirm him. Then Abel is born. Abel, gentle, quiet, almost effortless in the way he moves through life. Where Cain battles thorns and stones, Abel tends soft wool and living creatures. Where Cain grows food by force, Abel nurtures animals that follow his voice. Their vocations are not in conflict, but something inside Cain begins to sense a difference. Abel seems lighter, softer, closer to the God their parents speak of. Cain works, Abel watches. Cain digs, Abel guides. Cain fights the earth. Abel walks with the flock. And then comes the moment that defines them both. The first offering in human history. No instructions, no rituals, no tradition. Just two brothers stepping forward with what their hands have produced. Cain brings the fruit of the ground, a respectable offering, the honest work of a farmer. Abel brings the firstborn of his flock, the finest portions, a gesture of priority, of costliness, of surrender. And God looks with favor on Abel's offering, but not on Cain's. No explanation is given, no reasons are spoken. Heaven is silent, and Cain is left standing before a God who seems to turn his face toward Abel and away from him. In that moment, something ancient and painful awakens inside him, something every human being knows but Cain feels first. The sting of being overlooked, the heat of jealousy, the ache of wanting to be enough, and the fear that you aren't. This is the paradox that frames his entire story. How can the first worshipper also become the first murderer? How can the child who opens human history with life be the same man who will stain that history with death? Cain stands between Eden and exile, between worship and wrath, between longing and fury. His heart is not yet corrupted beyond repair, but it trembles, it cracks, and the distance between his offering and Abel's becomes the distance between admiration and resentment, between disappointment and violence. In this moment, Cain becomes the mirror of the human condition. He is not evil, he is wounded. He is not heartless, he is hungry. He is not born a killer. He becomes one step by step, emotion by emotion, until his heart can no longer hold the weight of its own bitterness. Behind him is Eden's memory. Before him is the field where history will bleed. Around him is the silence of God, inviting, warning, whispering. Within him is a storm he does not yet understand. And from this tension, from this ache, from this trembling precipice between devotion and destruction, the central mystery rises. How does a heart that seeks God become a hand that kills? And how does a God who sees the crime still choose to protect the criminal? This is the question Cain cannot escape, and the question that will follow us into the next part of his story. The hands that work the soil. Cain grew into his place in the world the way the earth itself grows, crops slowly, through pressure, through seasons that refuse to bend to human desire. The land he worked was not the lush garden his parents once knew. It was the ground outside of Eden, the soil that had tasted the curse of disobedience. Every seed Cain planted reminded him of what had been lost long before he was born. The thorns that tore his skin were the same thorns that grew when his parents stepped away from God. And yet, in that harsh soil, Cain planted his identity. He was the first to understand what it meant to labor with no memory of paradise. Adam had known the soft wind of the garden, the fragrance of unfallen creation, the ease of work that brought joy instead of sweat. Cain knew none of that. For him, the world had always been rough and stubborn. He did not compare his life to Eden. He only knew this world, this hardness, this earth, and in it he sought meaning. Cain became a farmer not by accident, but by inheritance. Adam taught him how to till the ground, how to read the sky, how to wait for rain in a world where rain was no longer a gentle blessing but a question mark. He learned the weight of responsibility the moment his hands were strong enough to grip a tool. Being the firstborn meant more than simply being older. It meant carrying the unspoken hopes of a family trying to rebuild life outside perfection. Cain felt those hopes deeply. He wanted to make Adam proud. He wanted Eve to look at him with the same joy she had the day he was born. He wanted, more than anything, to be seen by God with the same warmth he had heard about in his parents' stories of a garden where every leaf glowed with his presence. Cain wanted a share of that lost closeness. He wanted God to look at him not as the child of a mistake, but as a man worthy of blessing. It was into this silent longing that his brother Abel was born. Abel came into the world like a whisper, gentle, easy, soft around the edges. Where Cain wrestled with the ground, Abel walked with the flock. Cain's days were filled with the groaning of the earth. Abel's were accompanied by the bleating of lambs and the quiet rhythm of shepherding. Their vocations were not rivals, but they shaped them differently. Cain grew strong and hardened by labor. Abel grew sensitive and observant, shaped by the tender dependence of the animals he cared for. Despite the differences, they were brothers. They learned to laugh together, to help one another, to navigate this new world where every path was still forming beneath their feet. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, something shifted in Cain's heart. Abel seemed to move through life with a softness that Cain could never quite grasp. Abel's work seemed peaceful, while Cain's was a constant struggle against the earth's resistance. Abel's offerings of wool, of milk, of the firstlings of his flock carried a symbolism Cain could feel, but not articulate. Abel was the keeper of life. Cain was the keeper of earth. And though both stood before God, Cain began to wonder whose hands heaven preferred. Still, both brothers grew into men who knew they must offer something to God. They had no temple, no priesthood, no commandments. But there was something in the human soul that recognized the need to give back to the one who had given them breath. So Cain gathered the fruit of the ground, the grain, the produce, the harvest he had wrestled from stubborn soil. It was honest work. It was the labor of his hands. It was the first offering ever made by a human being. Abel also brought an offering, the firstborn of his flock, the best of what he had. The lamb, soft and pure, carried a symbolism beyond words. The costliness of devotion, the giving of what is precious, the surrender of something living. Cain had brought what the land offered him. Abel brought what his heart offered God. And then came the moment that changed everything. God regarded Abel's offering with favor, but Cain's offering found no such response. Scripture gives no explanation. Heaven offered no words of comfort or clarity. Cain only knew one thing. Abel was accepted. He was not. For Cain, this was not a small matter. It was a wound, a deep one. His entire life, every ache, every effort, every hope had been poured into the soil. Now, as he stood before the God he longed to please, he felt unseen, overlooked, rejected, and rejection in a soul already shaped by hardship becomes a dangerous seed. His face fell, his heart closed. He could not understand why God turned toward Abel and not toward him. He had not come empty-handed. He had not been careless. He had brought what he knew, what he grew, what he had. But something in his offering lacked the posture God desired something Abel's offering held. Perhaps it was the costliness. Perhaps it was the surrender. Perhaps it was simply the orientation of the heart. But Cain, unable to see the quiet truth within himself, saw only the difference between them, and that difference felt like an accusation. Abel did not gloat. Abel did not boast. He merely received God's favor with quiet humility. But in Cain's heart, jealousy bloomed like a shadow stretching across the field. He began to compare. He began to resent. He began to question whether the God his parents once walked with was truly fair, truly just, truly mindful of the struggle he carried every day. And yet, this is what makes Cain's rise so tragically human. He was not a monster. He was a man who wanted to be loved, a man who wanted to matter, a man who wanted God to look at him with the same favor he had heard whispered in stories of Eden. Cain's rise is not a rise of glory, but of yearning, a longing to be enough in the eyes of heaven. Cain stood at the altar of offering, his hands stained with the dust of the earth, his heart trembling with unmet desire. He did not yet know what he would become. He only knew what he wanted, the approval of a God whose face felt just out of reach. In that moment, before the fall, before the field, before the blood, Cain was simply a man searching for meaning in a world that had lost its innocence. He was the firstborn trying to build something good from the ruins of paradise. He was a worker who wanted his labor to be seen. He was the first worshipper standing before God with something to give, hoping desperately that it would be enough. This is where his rise reaches its height, not in triumph, but in vulnerability, not in pride, but in longing. And it is from here, from this fragile place where hope and hurt intertwine, that everything begins to turn. Sin at the door. Cain's heart had begun to darken, but no one heard it. Anger does not always roar. Sometimes it settles quietly behind the ribs, tightening slowly, breath by breath. Cain had always known the weight of the earth, but now he carried a new weight, a weight inside him, heavy and shapeless, born from a feeling he could not name. Rejection, envy, shame. They swirled together in a storm that made it hard for him to stand upright under the sun he once welcomed. His face fell, and he could not lift it. Abel tried to speak to him, perhaps a gentle greeting, perhaps a quiet question, but Cain could no longer hear the world around him. It was as though the air had thickened, as though the sky had dimmed, as though the space between him and everyone else had widened into a distance no bridge could cross. Cain folded into himself. He shut the door of his heart. He nursed the wound that no one else could see. And then God came near. The voice that once walked in Eden now spoke into the troubled silence of Cain's soul. "Why are you angry? Why has your face fallen?" It was not a rebuke. It was an invitation, a chance to breathe, a chance to speak, a chance to let the wound be known so that healing could begin. But Cain said nothing. Silence became his shield, his weapon, his way of holding on to the bitterness he believed protected him from humiliation. God continued, not in thunder but in tenderness. If you do what is right, will you not be accepted? It was the closest thing to reassurance Cain had ever received, a promise that favor was not lost, that acceptance was still open, that the God who turned toward Abel could also turn toward him. Cain could have stepped into that promise. He could have offered again with a different heart. He could have let the truth soften him. But his silence deepened, and then came the warning, the first warning ever given to a human heart. Sin is crouching at your door. It desires to have you, but you must rule over it. The words hung in the air like a veil between life and death. Sin was described not as an idea, but as a creature, a hunter, a predator, waiting, breathing, watching. The door God spoke of was not a physical door. It was Cain's heart, the place where choices are born, the place where desire becomes action. Cain felt it somewhere inside. He knew the danger. He knew that the anger curling inside him was not harmless. He knew he was standing at the edge of something irreversible, but knowing is not the same as yielding. In moments like these, every human soul faces a crossroads: surrender to truth or surrender to self. Cain turned away from God's voice, not in defiance, but in wounded pride. Pride is a quiet destroyer. It whispers that correction is humiliation. It convinces the heart that being wrong is worse than being lost. And Cain, desperate to feel seen, could not bear the thought that his offering had been lacking, not when he had worked so hard to produce it. He walked away, carrying with him the warning he refused to heed. Behind him, God's voice faded. Before him, sin remained at the door. Within him, the storm grew. And this moment, this quiet, trembling moment, is the turning point of the entire story. Not the murder, not the curse, not the exile, but this. The moment when Cain decides who will rule his heart. The God who warned him, or the sin that waited for him. Every tragedy begins long before the final blow. Every downfall begins in the heart before it begins in the world. And Cain, standing at the doorway of choice, stepped toward the darkness that lay ahead. The field was waiting. The blood was waiting. History was waiting. And Cain's next step would change the world forever. The field, the blood, the curse, the mark. The days after God's warning were strangely quiet. Cain moved through them like a man trapped inside his own shadow. He tilled the soil, but the soil no longer felt familiar to him. It resisted him, like a living thing that sensed the turmoil inside its keeper. Every swing of his tool felt heavier than the last. The ground he once battled with a sense of purpose now mocked him with its dryness, its thorns, its refusal to yield easily. The earth had always been hard, but now it seemed hostile. Abel moved through those same days in his gentle rhythm, guiding his flock, tending the lambs, singing soft melodies to himself. There was nothing provocative about Abel, nothing boastful. But sometimes what wounds us most deeply is not someone else's pride, but their innocence. Abel's calm, Abel's peace, Abel's quiet devotion, these qualities pressed down on Cain's heart like weights he didn't know how to lift. Cain watched him from afar, sometimes from the corner of his eye, sometimes from a distance greater than he needed, sometimes with a stare that lingered too long, filled with something he didn't dare name. Abel had done nothing to earn Cain's resentment, but resentment does not always need a reason. It only needs a wound. And Cain's wound, though invisible, was widening. It might have been a morning like any other when Cain approached Abel. The sky might have been bright, the grass still damp, the air cool enough to suggest the day had not yet made up its mind about how hot it would become. Cain's voice may have been steady or trembling. The text does not say. It simply says, Cain said to Abel his brother, "Let us go out to the field." The field, the place Cain knew best. The place where he had spent his entire life. The place where he felt both strongest and most alone. Abel followed him. Why wouldn't he? They were brothers, blood of the same parents, children of the same exile, sons under the same sky. Abel had no reason to fear. Cain had always been strong, protective, capable. If Abel noticed the tension in Cain's face or the weight in his silence, he said nothing. He assumed the best. because Abel's heart was not trained to see danger where none should exist. They walked into the field, away from the tents, away from their parents, away from the watchful eyes of the horizon, into the quiet. The ground beneath their feet was familiar to both of them, though in different ways. To Abel it was a place where sheep grazed. To Cain it was a place of toil, frustration, sweat. Now it was becoming something else entirely, a stage for the first human tragedy. Cain had likely rehearsed this moment in his mind, not as a plan, but as an impulse that pulsed louder and louder the more he refused to confront it. Anger grows when ignored. Jealousy strengthens when left unspoken. Pride builds a fortress when no confession breaks its walls. And inside Cain, all three had conspired together. There was no fight, no struggle, no warning, only a blow. The first blow in human history. And blood, the first human blood, fell onto the earth. It spread into the soil Cain had worked his whole life. The soil that had resisted him. The soil he had tried to master. The soil now stained with the life of his own brother. The ground drank Abel's blood, and in that moment something irreversible happened. The earth became a witness to the violence, a witness to Cain's hidden act, a witness to the shattering of innocence that no one else had seen. Cain stood over Abel's body. The silence was enormous. The world itself seemed to hold its breath. There were no sirens, no screams, no crowds. Only the wind moving slowly through the grass, as if uncertain how to touch a world that had just changed. Cain looked down, and perhaps for the first time understood the weight of what a human hand could do. He knew what it meant to break the soil. Now he knew what it meant to break a life. The difference was infinite, unbridgeable, terrible. He walked away, leaving Abel in the field. But he could not leave the field behind. When he returned home, the world was the same. His parents were the same, the sky was the same, but he was not. He carried something now, something lodged between his ribs and his spine, something heavy and cold. Guilt is not always loud. Often it is a quiet stone placed where the heart should be. And then God spoke, not with anger, not with lightning, not with thunder shaking the world apart, but with a question, where is your brother Abel? Cain could have fallen to his knees. He could have cried. He could have confessed. He could have begged for mercy. He could have acknowledged the weight of what he had done. Instead, he lied. I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper? The words were sharp, almost casual. The first recorded lie from one human to God. The first rhetorical question asked in defiance. The first attempt to hide guilt behind sarcasm. Every sentence Cain spoke was a deeper step into darkness. But God already knew. He always knew. What have you done? The voice of your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground. Blood has a voice in God's ears. The earth itself testifies. Creation tattles on sin. No crime is truly secret. And then came the judgment. Not shouted, but spoken with gravity. The ground, which had always been hard for Cain, would now resist him completely. It would no longer yield to him. The work that had once shaped him would now reject him. He would become a wanderer, never rooted, never settled, never at home. Cain's identity, farmer, laborer, firstborn, was being stripped from him piece by piece. Cain's response was not repentance. It was fear. My punishment is greater than I can bear. Anyone who finds me will kill me. The irony is profound. The first murderer feared becoming the first murder victim. The one who struck without mercy now feared receiving none. He was terrified not of his guilt, but of his consequences. And then something unexpected happened. God showed mercy, not the soft mercy of ignoring sin, not the fragile mercy of pretending nothing happened, but the fierce mercy of protection in judgment. God placed a mark on Cain, not a curse, but a shield, a mark that said, "Do not kill him. He belongs to me still. Judgment is mine, not yours." This mark is one of the strangest symbols in Scripture. It exposes Cain, but it also protects him. It declares his guilt, but it forbids revenge. It sends him away, but it does not abandon him. Cain, the first murderer, became Cain, the first man protected by divine mercy. haven in exile. He walked away from his family, from the land he once worked, from the brother he would never see again. He walked east of Eden, further from the garden than his parents had ever been, further from home, further from innocence. Yet even there, the mark remained on him. A reminder that God does not release his grip, even when humans release their obedience. Cain stepped into the world as a wanderer, a man carrying both guilt and grace, both punishment and protection, both darkness and an unexpected echo of divine love. This is the fall. This is the wound in the beginning of the human story. And this is the paradox that sets the stage for what comes next. The mark and the mercy. Cain walked east of Eden with dust clinging to his feet and the mark of God etched into his skin. The world beyond the familiar fields stretched wide and empty before him, a landscape untouched by memory. Every step he took carried him further from the home he once knew and further from the brother whose blood cried out from the earth behind him. But even as the horizon swallowed him, something remained, something he could not shake. The mark, not a weapon, not a curse, a declaration, a boundary, a mercy. He had killed his brother. He had lied to God. He had hardened his heart, ignored warning, surrendered to envy, and become the first embodiment of what sin could do when it ruled a human soul. And yet, God had not allowed vengeance to swallow him. God had not erased him. God had not abandoned him to the justice of human hands. The first man to shed innocent blood became the first man protected from bloodshed by divine decree. This is the core of the paradox. Cain deserved death, yet he received life. He deserved vengeance, yet he received protection. He deserved abandonment, yet God watched over him still. The mark on Cain was not a badge of honor, nor a stain of shame. It was a symbol of a truth older than sin itself. God's mercy goes further than human guilt can reach. Even in the earliest days of the world, before laws, before covenants, before prophets, God revealed something about his heart, a refusal to let judgment be the final word over a human life, even a guilty one. Cain settled in the land of Nod, east of Eden, a place whose very name means wandering. He carried exile in his bones. He carried guilt like a shadow that stretched across every dawn. And yet, life continued. Cain built a city. He had children. He built structures, stories, generations. His hands, which had once taken life, now shaped the beginnings of human civilization. He became the father of those who play instruments, who forge tools, who inhabit tents, an unexpected legacy for someone who once stood alone in a field with blood on his hands. This does not erase his guilt. It does not soften the crime, but it reveals something profound about the God who shaped him. The Lord of creation refuses to let sin be the end of the story. Not for Adam, not for Eve, not even for Cain. There is an ache woven through Cain's narrative, a reminder that sin fractures not only the sinner but the world around him. Cain's descendants, recorded briefly in Genesis, include men of violence, men who boast in killing, men who repeat in louder tones the rage that once whispered to Cain in the field. Sin flows downward. It ripples, it repeats. The first murder becomes a warning hidden in the genealogies of humanity. Blood begets blood unless grace intervenes. But even in that generational echo, God's mercy does not disappear. The story of Cain ends not with an execution, but with a city. Not with a grave, but with a lineage. The first murderer becomes the first builder. The man driven from home becomes the founder of a new place. The sinner becomes an ancestor. And in this strange, unsettling mixture of guilt and grace, a truth rises from the dust. God can work through broken humans. God can weave purpose through shattered hearts. God can draw lines of redemption through lives that seem unredeemable. Cain's story is uncomfortable because it forces us to see something we do not want to see, that the line between worship and violence, devotion and resentment, humility and pride, is dangerously thin. What separates Cain from Abel in the end is not the offering, but the heart that held it. Cain teaches us that being the firstborn, being strong, being hard-working, being near the altar, none of these protect a person from the danger within. Sin does not need a large doorway, it only needs a crack. Yet Cain also teaches us something equally important. Even when sin triumphs, even when the heart fails, even when envy becomes violence, God's mercy is not undone. The mark on Cain is the first symbol of divine protection over a guilty soul. It whispers a truth that reverberates throughout Scripture. God is committed to humanity even when humanity betrays him. Cain left Eden's shadow with a mark he did not choose, a burden he carried until his final breath. But he also carried the strange comfort of knowing that even in judgment, God had looked upon him. God had spoken his name. God had reached into the darkness and said, "You may not die, because I am still watching over you." The final echo of Cain's life is neither condemnation nor praise. It is warning and mercy intertwined. It invites us to see ourselves in the places we do not want to look, the envy we hide, the anger we nurse, the pride we protect, the choices we make when no one is watching. But it also invites us to remember the God who warns before we fall, who speaks before we break, who marks before he abandons, and who never stops calling even the most wounded heart back toward himself. In the end, Cain's story is the story of every human heart that has ever stood before God with something to offer, longed to be accepted, and wrestled with what rises when we are not. It is the story of the first murderer, yes, but it is also the story of the first man to discover that even in the aftermath of sin, God's mercy walks beside exile. And that is the echo Cain leaves behind, that the God who judged him was also the God who protected him, and the God who sent him away was still the God who did not let him go.